Howdy, folks. This is Western author Mark L. Redmond coming to you from Apache Junction, Arizona, where currently it's about 106 degrees. We've lived in Apache Junction for a couple years now, but we moved to a different place. This is the first video I've made in my new study in our new house. I'm even wearing a new hat. But I'm here to tell you about a new book. I have the third book in the Nate Landry series. Bounty Hunter Nate Landry, Dust Devil, is in the process of being published. My goal is to have it published by September 1st, which will be my 70th birthday. So that'll be kind of a special present for me. From me to me, I guess. Happy birthday to me. But I'm going to share the first chapter of this book with you, the way I have the rest of the books that I've written. This will be the latest installment in my first chapter series. Once I get my spectacles on here. Here's chapter 1 of Bounty Hunter Nate Landry, Dust Devil. I pushed open the batwing doors, walked into the half-empty saloon, and sauntered to the bar. The barkeep gave me a nod. "What do you have, partner?" he asked. "Beer," I replied, "and some of that grub." I smiled at him. He looked more like an undertaker than a barkeep. He was a couple inches taller than my 6-foot stature, and probably 25 to 30 pounds lighter. His black hair was slicked back and parted in the middle. His nose looked like a beak. As he slid my beer toward me, he nodded at a plate of sandwiches and a bowl of pickled eggs at the end of the bar. "Help yourself and have a seat," he said. "I'm obliged for the food," I said, "but I've been in the saddle for the past few days. Will I be in your way if I stand here while I eat?" The barkeep chuckled. "You won't be in my way if you stay on that side of the bar. If you come back here, I'll hand you an apron and give you a job." I walked to the end of the bar, took an empty plate from the stack, and put 2 sandwiches and an egg on it. Experience had taught me to slide the plate along the smooth surface of the bar instead of carrying it back to where the barkeep had placed my beer. The egg was much less likely to roll off the plate when the plate stayed level. I had eaten the egg and half of a sandwich when I finished my beer. I glanced at the barkeep and saw him heading toward me with a smile and a second beer. I thanked him and continued to eat. Although I stood with my back to the room, the mirror that covered the large portion of the wall behind the bar allowed me to examine the other folks in the room as I ate. I didn't see anyone who fit the description on the wanted posters I carried in one of my saddlebags. 4 days ago, I had ridden away from Phoenix, where I'd spent 3 weeks recovering from a bullet wound on the side of my head. Wolf had left 2 weeks earlier to visit a lady I reckoned he might one day marry. When I felt well enough to travel, I had ridden southeast toward Florence, watching along the way for outlaws. Since I didn't see anyone in the saloon who looked as if he had a price on his head, I was trying to decide whether to stay in Florence for the night or ride another hour or so down the trail that led to my cabin. I was finishing my second sandwich when 5 or 6 horses thundered past the saloon. The riders crouched low in their saddles, and as they disappeared in a cloud of dust, gunfire erupted from somewhere down the street in the direction from which they had come. I drank the last of my beer, slapped 2 bits on the bar, and started toward the door. Just before I reached the batwings, they flew open, and I found myself facing a small, wiry, brown-skinned man wearing a badge and a 6-shooter. He glanced at me, stepped around me, and spoke to the other men in the saloon. "Somebody just robbed the bank," he said. "I need men for a posse." The marshal was a foot shorter than I am, so when I turned around I could see over his head. Most of the men sat, looking at the floor. 3 men, who had been sitting at the same table, pushed their chairs back and stood. "We'll ride with you, Juan," one of them said. "I'm obliged," said the marshal. "I need 5 or 6 more men." Nobody looked at him or spoke. "They took your money," he said. "You don't want to try and get it back?" "We have families, Juan." Whoever had spoken hadn't moved or looked at the marshal. "Let's ride," he said. He shook his head. "They ain't going to sit along the road and wait for us." As he turned to leave, I stepped between him and the batwings. "I'll ride with you, Marshal," I said. Starting with my boots and working up to my face, he looked me over. "Why would you do that?" he asked. "You're a stranger." "It seems like the right thing to do," I said. "I am obliged for your help," he said. "Let's ride." I had tied Mac's reins to the hitching rail in front of the saloon. I tightened the saddle girth and mounted him. Patting his neck, I said, "Let's catch some outlaws, partner." Wolf and I agreed that riding with a posse was usually a bad idea. As I sat in the saddle for the next quarter of an hour, waiting for the other 4 riders, I remembered one of the reasons we felt the way we did. The marshal showed up a few minutes before the other 3 men. He stopped his horse beside Mac and extended his right hand toward me. "I'm Juan Lopez," he said. "Nate Landry," I replied. I shook his hand. "You have any idea who we're after?" I asked. "Not a clue," he said. As the other posse members stopped their horses beside him, the marshal looked at them. "Amigos?" he asked. They nodded their heads. Ned said all 5 bandits kept their faces covered and only one of them spoke. This report came from the man nearest the marshal. The marshal turned toward me. "Ned is the owner of the bank," he said. "Well, gents, let's go get our money back." As we rode out of town, we held our horses to a walk until we'd passed the last buildings. I reckon the marshal was protecting both children and grown folks who stepped into the street without checking for oncoming horses or wagons. He spurred his horse to a gallop as soon as we had left town. Mac kept pace with the marshal's horse. I decided to ride with the marshal at the front of the posse so we could communicate easily. I also wanted to be able to read the trail signs before the rest of the men had ridden over them. I didn't know if any of the other men could follow a trail or not, but I wasn't taking any chances. Less than half a mile outside town, we slowed our horses to a walk. The dirt on the road was packed too hard to show any tracks. The marshal and I rode on opposite sides, watching for signs that someone had left the road. "It seems that the bank robbers are getting farther ahead of us while we're lollygagging like this, Juan." One of the posse men had caught up until he rode beside the marshal. He was a tall, thin, clean-shaven man with neatly trimmed blond hair. He wore a black derby hat that looked new. His shirt and pants also looked new, and his boots had been polished recently. He sat ramrod straight in his saddle. "Well, Mr. Baylor," the marshal said, "I don't reckon these hombres stayed on the road too long unless they're stupid." He removed his hat and his bandana, wiped the sweat from his face, neck, and head, and replaced his hat. Holding his bandana by one corner, he let the breeze begin to dry it. "Why not?" Baylor asked. "I'd stay on the road." When the marshal glanced at me, I shrugged my shoulders. "I reckon you would," I said. Baylor turned in his saddle to glare at me. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked. "I wasn't talking to you anyway." He turned back to the marshal. "The nearest town is more than 25 miles away," the marshal said, "even though it's only a wide spot in the road with a trading post and 3 cabins. If these hombres follow the road to that town, they'll have to ride hard to stay ahead of us. 5 riders coming into a town on tired horses would draw too much attention. The other 2 posse members had ridden forward so they could hear the conversation. The one closer to the marshal spoke. "So, you reckon these Alhoots left the road? And you and—" He looked at me and raised his eyebrows. "Nate Jackson," I said. I didn't mind letting Juan know who I was, but I reckoned it wouldn't hurt if the others thought I was just a drifter. Bounty hunters aren't always welcomed by townsfolk. "Dan Pierce," he said. He touched the brim of his brown Stetson, smiled, and turned back to the marshal. "So, you and Nate are watching for the place where they turned off." He removed his hat and wiped his bald head with his bandana. After replacing his hat, he tied the bandana around his neck. "That makes all kinds of sense." Baylor muttered something as we rode forward, but nobody paid attention to him. We had ridden less than a mile when I spotted the first tracks leaving the road. I dismounted and crouched to examine them more closely. "How many riders?" asked the marshal. "1," I said. "These hombres are smart. They'll be harder to catch if they split up." "If you'll follow this trail, amigo," he said, "we'll follow the road to find the other places where they turned off." He brushed a fly away from his face. "Is that acceptable to you?" I swung into my saddle. "It is," I said. "When I reach the end of this trail or figure out where it's headed, I'll catch up with you." "Vaya con Dios," said the marshal. "You too," I said. I nudged Mac with my heels, and he headed into the brush. As I rode over the rolling ground, weaving through brush and rocks, I could see that whoever I was following had made no attempt to cover his tracks. I reckoned he must not have expected anyone to come after him. "He underestimated us, Mac," I said. "That should make our job a mite easier." Experience had taught me that arrogant outlaws are often easier to catch, because they believe they're a lot smarter than the people chasing them. That kind of thinking usually leads them to make careless mistakes, and those mistakes get them caught. About half a mile off the road, I reined Mac to a halt and dismounted. The tracks told me an interesting story. Early that morning, probably before sunrise, someone had hidden a horse and buggy in the brush. The rider I was following had stepped down from his horse and climbed into the buggy. Then, with his horse tied to the back of the rig, they had driven off in the same direction, headed away from the road. I looked at Mac and shrugged my shoulders. "Doesn't make much sense to me either, partner," I said. I patted his neck and then swung into the saddle. "Let's see what this hombre is up to." Following the tracks left by the buggy was easy. The driver had made a gradual turn that led back to the road less than a mile from where the rider had left it. Since we'd been looking for fresh tracks from single horses leaving the road, Juan and I had overlooked the older trail left by the buggy. "Well, partner," I said to Mac, "let's see what the rest of the posse has discovered." I turned him in the direction the posse had gone and let him run. When Mac began to tire, he slowed to a trot and eventually to a walk. I reckoned we had covered close to 4 miles when I saw the posse headed toward us. I reined Mac to a halt and waited until they stopped in front of us. Before Marshal Lopez spoke, I knew they hadn't caught up with any of the outlaws. When I nodded at him, he shook his head. "I reckon we're chasing some smart hombres," he said. "We found 4 more places where a rider turned off the road." He loosened the leather strap of his canteen from his saddle horn and took a drink. "We followed each trail until it led us to rocky ground and disappeared." He wiped his sleeve across his mouth and looped the canteen strap around the saddle horn again. "Did you find anything?" "I did," I said. "I'll tell you about it on the way back to town." We let our horses walk. I rode between Marshal Lopez and Baylor, with Pierce and the other man close behind us. Speaking loudly enough for all 4 men to hear me, I told them what I'd found. "That proves nothing to me," Baylor said. "I didn't reckon it would," I said. Baylor's face reddened as he turned toward me. Did anybody ever tell you that you have a smart mouth? He asked. I've lost track of how many, I said, but I don't take offense. I look at it as kind of a gift. I smiled at Baylor. His nostrils flared and his upper lip twisted into a snarl, revealing his clenched teeth. Why, you easy, Mr. Baylor, said Marshal Lopez. There's nothing to get riled about. Baylor didn't speak, but I was pretty sure I heard a low growl. He glared at me for a few seconds and then turned his attention to the road ahead of us. I was still smiling. What do you make of the tracks you found? Asked the marshal. He swatted at a fly that buzzed near his face. You reckon they came from one of the bank robbers? I do, I said. Now we just need to figure out what those tracks mean. I reckon we'll find some answers when we get back to town. And that's the first chapter of Bounty Hunter Nate Landry, Dust Devil. And those of you who don't know what a dust devil is, if you've probably seen one, but you just may not realize what it is. It's when the wind catches the dust and makes what looks like a little tornado. And it'll blow along for a while. Well, sometimes it's big. It'll blow along for a while and then it just disappears. The wind either scatters it or drops it, one or the other. But I had a lot of fun writing this story, and I hope you'll have a lot of fun reading it. I'm planning on, well, if all the ducks get in a row and none of them fly away when they're supposed to be in line, I'm planning to have this published by September 1st, my 70th birthday. And that may or may not happen, but it'll be sometime around then, I hope. In the meantime, I'm keeping busy. Those of you who are familiar with the Artie Anderson series, I have study guides for Artie Goes West and Artie and the Hunt for Phantom, the two books in that series. And I'm making them digital. Right now they're available in hard copies. They're just paperback study guides. They're excellent study guides. Not because I had something to do with them necessarily, but my oldest daughter, Melody, taught with me at Grace Baptist Schools, now Granger Christian Schools. She taught with me at Granger Christian for 3 years. And I made the study guides, and she took a look at them and said, Dad, you're a high school teacher. These are too hard for elementary kids. So we went back over them together, and she made them, she scaled them to where they would be usable for elementary kids. So they're really good. They have lots of fun things to do. They have quizzes and vocabulary and one exam and keys for everything, so it'll be easy for the teachers. They have some really fun projects that I think kids will enjoy. So those are available, and I'm making a deal. I'm trying to reach out to homeschoolers. I would like to make these guides available to homeschoolers, and I'm offering a deal where if they buy 1 or 2 copies of Artie Goes West or more, or Artie and the Hunt for Phantom, I'll give them a hard copy of the Teacher's Guide free. So if you know anybody that's homeschooling and would be interested in an offer like that, just have them get a hold of me. My contact information is all over my website, which is www.marklredmond.com. Easy peasy. Also, I'm working on audiobooks. I have the first book in this series, the Nate Landry, Bounty Hunter Nate Landry book series. I have the first one recorded. I've sent it to our oldest son, Ryan, who is a technician. He's graduated with a degree in sound effects and with things way more complicated than making an audiobook. And he's going to help me, and we're going to try to make all of the books I've written available in audiobook format. So be watching for that as well. This is Thursday, Thursday, August 8th. I'm hoping Monday to start writing the next Box M Gang, the second in the Box M Gang series. I'm working on turning it into a series. Right now it's just one book, so it technically isn't a series, but I'm going to do everything I can to make it into one. And I left those poor kids stranded out there on their ranch with no parents. They're orphans. And I need to get back there and see what they're up to. And then I'll get that second book ready. I hope that one, usually that book won't take as long as this one that I just finished took. Those books are a little easier to write. But I'll be busy on that next week, I hope. In the meantime, I have a newspaper editor that's wanting to interview me. Once we get into probably October or so, we'll start having festivals again. The manager of a local Barnes and Noble bookstore is communicating with me and wants to put my books in their store, as well as possibly 20 other stores in the area, and wants me to come to her store for book signings. So we're excited about that as well. So that's it for now. I hope you folks are doing well. I hope if you haven't read all my books yet, I hope you'll grab one today and or tomorrow will be soon enough, I guess, and read it. And I hope you enjoy it. I wrote these books to be enjoyed. Best book in the world isn't any good if nobody reads it. But that's all I have for you for now. Check out my YouTube page if you haven't already. The other books I have are on my YouTube channel, as well as this one that you're watching right now. Happy trails, folks. I'll talk to you again soon.